Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm joined today by Adrienne Buller, Senior Research Fellow at Commonwealth. Adrienne has written for The Guardian, Jacobin, The New Statesman, New Left Review, and Financial Times, among many others. She is the author of The Value of a Whale, on the Illusions of Green Capitalism, and co-author with Matthew Lawrence of Owning the Future, Power and Property in an Age of Crisis. Thank you, Adrienne, for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Adrienne, we've been nearly 20 years now. We've been in a period of intersecting and systemic crises, and there's worse to come, especially when you consider the impact of climate change. Your two books cover these crises, but also contain many ideas about solutions to these. And I want to talk about some of these today. But could we start with vision, the kind of society that you'd like to see, and the kind of society that Commonwealth would like to see?
Yeah, definitely. I'll start with Commonwealth maybe and build from there. So we, are sort of not-for-profit think tank, just for context. And what we focus on really is the question of democracy as it pertains to kind of economic life. So thinking about democracy as it extends beyond, participating in maybe, a national government kind of ballot box style vote once every few years, thinking about how systems of democratic governance could extend into many more parts of our lives, whether that's having more participation and sort of voice and empowerment in your workplace, for example, where most of us spend the majority of our time and often have, relations that are defined by kind of hierarchy or kind of domination. So thinking about ways to change that, and also extending it to, I guess, governance and the organization of all the systems that sort of provide the fundamentals that we all need to kind of survive and to thrive in society. So thinking about how ownership and sort of democracy could feed into sort of water systems, energy, food systems, transport, all of these kind of very fundamental areas of life that right now are sort of organized in quite an undemocratic way, organized around, private sector interests. And so thinking about how we could sort of change that. So I guess vision-wise, I would definitely want to see a much more democratic economy. So where, all of those fundamental systems are kind of owned and organized around meeting sort of human and social and environmental needs. And sort of the extension of democratic principles into many more facets of our life than it currently is. And of course, lastly, the book Value of a Whale is really about sort of climate and biodiversity crisis. It's thinking about how we could organize the kind of phenomenal wealth that we have and that we produce in the world, and the incredible sort of resources we have available to us to give everyone, a kind of thriving existence, and thinking about how we can distribute that and organize that in a way that both, serves people much better than it currently does, and also kind of does so within the kind of limits of, not, contributing to biodiversity loss or an accelerating climate crisis. So that's the grand vision, I guess.
I mean, we'll come back to the value of a whale in a moment, but we face many obstacles to this vision, don't we? And one of them is about the ownership of assets, which is the other book we're talking about today. Tell us about that as a problem.
Yeah, definitely. So again, our work at Commonwealth and Owning the Future really focuses on this. Looks at how ownership and the nature of kind of the rights and privileges granted to specific forms of property and ownership really structure how our economy operates, organizes production, and really structures the economy according to certain imperatives and in service of certain interests. So in the UK, as well as in many other kind of peer countries like the US or Canada, where I'm from, we really have economies organized predominantly around a single form of ownership, which is sort of private corporate ownership, private individual ownership of assets. And that might be, financial assets, or it could be land, or it could be, as I mentioned before, the companies that provide sort of basic services. And, as a product of that, all of those assets are sort of used for one very narrow set of interests broadly, which is to sort of maximize returns for whoever happens to be fortunate enough to be the owner of certain assets. And So in every sense, I guess, ownership and the distribution of it and the nature of kind of rights and privileges attached to that, whether that's, limited liability in the case of corporations. So, shareholders having limits on how much they're kind of on the hook if a company fails, for example. All of these privileges organize our economy in a very specific way. And I think the outcomes of that are often very clear, whether it's, crumbling kind of public services in many respects, from energy to water to transit, whether it's, escalating inequalities in sort of wealth and therefore kind of voice in the economy. All of these things, I think, are intimately related to questions of property and asset ownership. And I think, one of the things that I talk about, I guess, in both books is over the past, I guess, couple of decades, there's been a really significant, as there always has been, sort of shifts in how ownership is defined and how it's distributed. In the 1980s, the kind of neoliberal, if we can use that word, sort of revolution, really through privatization and the opening up of financial markets, accelerated a shift to this kind of private ownership. But then in the wake of the financial crisis, there's been what I would, I guess, articulate as another interesting kind of shift in ownership and its role in our economy. And that's the kind of rise of sort of big asset management firms, which is an industry that kind of does what it says on the tin. It manages assets on behalf of those who have them. Could be a rich individual. It's often a pension fund or a university endowment. And over the past 10, 15 years, there's been kind of an explosion of that industry, but also massive concentration within it. So that we now have just a handful of firms, 3, maybe 4, broadly US based, who absolutely dominate kind of ownership, not just of financial assets like stocks or bonds, but also increasingly of real estate, of commodities. And that's the case kind of across the globe, across every kind of economy. And that's having real implications for how, economies are organized and sort of what purposes companies might pursue, etc. And so, I would say that, asset ownership is a really vital structuring force, particularly in economies like the UK's, which have been so privatized over the past, 40 or so years.
And would you say one of the starkest examples of that is the housing crisis that we faced? We simply aren't building enough houses. The wrong people are building houses. I mean, not very far from me is a big development, which is going to be not just funded by, but owned and rented out by Lloyds Bank, for example. This is growing, I think, this ownership of property by big corporations for rental as well.
Yeah, one of the things that we always talk about at Commonwealth is one of the kind of most subtly kind of transformative policies of, our lifetime in the UK was absolutely right to buy. So the kind of Thatcherite policy of the ability to purchase social housing. And that's been utterly transformative, both in a practical sense, in this kind of mass sell-off of social housing and its transfer to kind of private ownership and those markets, but also in gradually the kind of attachment of individuals' economic outcomes and their sort of economic security and dignity, that's sort of tethering to home ownership as a kind of fundamental indicator of if you will, have a comfortable and dignified retirement, whether your children will be sort of better off than you. All these kinds of questions have become really fundamentally tied to the ownership of a house as an asset, right? So as a financial asset, rather than thinking of housing first and foremost as, a safe, secure place to live and inhabit. And the impacts of that definitely in the UK are, I think, quite evident to anyone who lives here. And as you were pointing out there, that's been more recently kind of started to be accelerated by interest from financial investors in housing as an asset. And so the US, this is much more pronounced, but there's a few kind of big, private equity investment giants that are buying up properties. It began again in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis when there was all sorts of foreclosures across the country, buying up those homes, building new developments and becoming sort of professionalized, financialized landlords. And that is gradually coming to the UK as well. And I think it's just kind of a more extreme version of what was set in motion several decades ago, that was sort of really fundamentally seeing housing not as first and foremost a basic need and right, but as sort of an economic and a financial asset.
We did a big project in 2019 looking at the centenary of the council estate, and Bristol was one of the first parts of the country to have a completed council estate, and this gave us a chance to reflect with many people their own experience of housing, particularly those of us, including myself, who grew up in council property. And I often think that, you know, how my life might have worked out so differently if my father and my mother hadn't had that council house to live in, which gave them a decent rent, security of tenure, and then they could go on and do all the other things that they did in life, whether that was work or my mother predominantly bringing up a family and doing huge amounts of voluntary work as well. I do feel, you know, the major problem we'll have, I think, is those people who are continuing to rent through their life, who spend so much on rental, who can't afford to invest in a pension, and they get to the age of 65, 68, whatever, and they paying huge rent without any income to back that up.
Yeah, and have no kind of security whatsoever. And what's interesting as well from the political perspective is that there's kind of, at least for progressives who often want to see, you know, different kind of housing policy or policy around pensions, around sort of wealth and income taxes, etc. You know, there is this incredibly entrenched and quite probably cleverly designed block of, you know, homeowners who, you know, any policy that infringes on home ownership as a fundamental right or as the correct way to organize housing and our economies more broadly is incredibly sort of politically toxic and borderline non-viable, whether you are the Conservatives or whether you're, you know, Labour. It's a real kind of quagmire for Labour to get out of thinking about alternative housing policies. You know, you've often been hemmed in by the fact that economic security is now so profoundly tied to ownership on a like individual private level of housing that it's really difficult to untether. But I think what you've pointed out there will be interesting to watch insofar as this kind of the increasingly sort of extreme insecurity of the system for many might end up kind of becoming that system's own grave digger. You know, if you have, as you pointed out there, an increasing situation where, you know, my generation, people slightly older or younger than me, you know, never being able to get on the housing ladder per se, not having access to pension security, not having access to any of these basic fundamental sources of dignity, may finally sort of put some cracks in what has been kind of a watertight system and political base for several decades now.
I want to come onto the value of Whale. Just before that, you talk about three tests for solutions put forward. Does it work? Does it work in a way that is durable? And does it create a future that is actually worth living in for the vast majority of people around the world? And when you have those three tests, you can apply them to all the kind of ideas that you put forward, not just in the value of a whale book, but also in owning the future as well, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I actually never thought, it's funny, it sounds obvious now to say that I should apply it in both senses, but I've never really considered it before. Yeah, it's definitely, it was something that came for me out of looking at climate policy, which I guess we'll get into through the value of a whale, and feeling as though, you know, our adherence to sort of the norms and ideas that tend to kind of predominate in economic and political kind of circles in sort of most policymaking, tended not to actually sort of engage with those three questions. A lot of the time, you know, setting aside the question of does this policy actually set out, you know, or accomplish what it sets out to do. And I think what I found perhaps surprising, perhaps unsurprising, is just how infrequently that first barrier is actually met in a lot of policymaking, because we tend to have to wedge everything through the prism of the sort of dominant economic thinking that we operate within. So is this, you know, viable in terms of, you know, functioning in a market-based sense? Can this generate returns? Is this sort of something that won't increase, you know, public debt? All these kind of questions tend to really restrict the solutions that we even consider viable. And that often compromises that very basic hurdle of, you know, will this actually give more people access to safe housing? Will this actually cut emissions? Will this actually preserve biodiversity? All these questions. So yeah, happy to turn to that now.
Well, let's start with the value of a whale. This came from the IMF putting the International Monetary Fund assigning a value to whales in terms of tourism and also carbon sequestration and so on. I mean, one of the things that if you've been, I've been in campaigning for a long time about things like the natural world and so on, and you're constantly looking for rationales to make your case and so on. But I suppose one of the things that's disturbed me most in recent years is this development of natural capital and the idea that you can put a value on something which should be valued simply for itself. So when you had the IMF putting the value on the whale, you contrasted that with you seeing a whale when you were, I think, when you were age of 7, was it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very striking study, which has now become not credited to my book, but kind of blew up. A lot of organizations have subsequently kind of covered this story. So very briefly, in 2019, the IMF published this study about arguably kind of trying to make the case for whale conservation. So I think what I try to get across and maybe fail to in the book is the idea that I think in this instance, as in many of these instances, the intentions of the study and of the undertaking were good, right? So in good faith, these researchers set out to try to evaluate what a whale is kind of worth economically, with the idea that this is necessary in order to save them and to see them as participating in our economic system. And that to me perfectly kind of captured the difficulty I have with so much climate policy making in particular, but this could apply, as you pointed out, to housing, to the way that we produce food or pharmaceuticals, etc. There's this idea that everything needs to be evaluated through the prism of its role in supporting, a capitalist economy, and therefore by extension in supporting kind of financial returns, profits, GDP growth, without which capitalism ceases to function. I think for me, as someone who grew up and was lucky enough to grow up on the sort of west coast of Canada, so in British Columbia, where I was very fortunate to be kind of embedded in pretty exquisite nature for a lot of my childhood. It just immediately registered as a shock, right? That a kind of sentient feeling being like a whale could be sort of distilled down to a single price tag. And I guess the rest of the book kind of evolves from there, which is this question of, why do we feel the need to funnel all policy making through this prism of, economic returns?
I want to talk about 3 areas in the value of whale, because there is this view that capitalism is the only solution. If you point out, it's put forward by Bill Gates and Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney and others, and I hear it talked about here as well in Bristol, as although Bristol has many more radical areas of activity as well. But this idea that you can, well, take for example one of them, carbon pricing. This is one of the green illusions, isn't it, that you talk about?
Yeah, this was probably maybe the most controversial argument in the book. And it's a difficulty that I had in writing the book, and that I still have in discussing it 2 years on from when I started writing some of it, and that will probably never go away, which is this tension between the fact that many of the sort of policies and solutions that we pursue that are sort of market-based and that are sort of integrated with capitalist logics are not delivering on their promise, and probably are design unable to, and I can get into unpacking that. And that's on one hand over here, but on the other hand is the fact that, time is short and dear, and, political revolution and a total shift of economic system is difficult, to put it gently. And so trying to understand, what can we reasonably expect and pursue that sort of sits between those two facts is really difficult. But I guess, those 3 sort of tests that you set out there a few minutes ago are the starting point for me. So the first question, and we'll look at carbon pricing in this respect, is does it work? And then the second, does it work in a way that is durable? And then thirdly, does it create a future that's, worth living in as opposed to just habitable? And woven through all of those 3 is this question of sort of justice. So does it create injustice for many, which is often the case with many of these policies? And I think of that as something that, particularly when it comes to the climate and ecological crises, is not just a nice to have, as many people think it is, but absolutely a need to have. Insofar as climate and ecological crises are so intertwined with the kind of profound inequalities in sort of wealth, income, consumption, waste, etc., that we see both within and between countries. So I'll set that out as like the framework from which I approach this question. People may contest it, but that's sort of the way I rationalize the problem. So carbon pricing is kind of the sort of default position of economists engaging on climate, and it's Bill Nordhaus, William Nordhaus is sort of probably the most prominent sort of climate economist in the world. I think, he talks about the carbon price as, the single most kind of elegant, inevitable resolution. Other economists talk about it as like the breathtakingly simple answer to all of our problems, which raises the question, why have carbon prices not sort of been universally applied? Why have they not been done at a way that is sort of effective at cutting emissions at the kind of pace that we need? And why are they so politically contested? And I think, carbon pricing is something that is theoretically very elegant, but very quickly comes up against a lot of pragmatic issues. So the idea of the carbon price, or of putting a value on a whale, is that, right now, because we don't price these things, the market as a system can't engage with them, because within the market, price dollar exchange is really, or pounds, sorry, I'm North American, is the only sort of language with which actors can speak to each other, can interact. So unless something has a price, the market can't properly engage with it, and therefore you get, what economists call externalities. So we don't price carbon emissions, therefore we overproduce them, because the people producing them don't have to pay for the consequences and impacts of those emissions. And so a carbon price says, if we put a price on carbon, we'll bring it into the market, internalize it to the market, and then actors in the market will just brilliantly resolve the problem, find ways to, cut that cost out of their operations. So again, very elegant as a concept. Many difficulties in sort of enacting carbon prices, from the kind of very basic political resistance. So if they're done crudely or designed poorly, you can end up raising the very basic cost of living for broadly people at the lower end of the income spectrum. That's created a lot of resistance in countries like Canada. You could think of the Gilets jaunes, the reaction to the kind of fuel taxes there, as a sort of version of that. But then the more kind of fundamental questions for me are about, what a carbon price would actually kind of deliver. And the idea is that, putting a price on carbon will gradually have people kind of eliminate that from the market. But there's a really brilliant paper that I cite from an academic called Cedric Durand, who will outline this like much more articulately than I can on this video. But he asks, for me, the very basic question, which is, why should we prioritize what markets do well, which is efficiently solving a problem from the perspective of kind of cost benefits, versus sort of effectively and justly and strategically resolving that problem over the long term with sort of strategic public kind of planning. And in the question of carbon, I think this is so fundamental because, as us living in the UK will have experienced this year, carbon and fossil fuels, by extension, are so embedded in every aspect of our lives, from access to energy, to food, where food prices are intimately related to rising costs of gas. And so if you just had sort of a uniform carbon price, which is the kind of dream of the economist, you would, be by default sort of treating emissions from food, from heating your home, from transport, as equivalent to sort of more spurious sources of carbon emissions, like maybe you drive an SUV or you sort of fly a lot. And I think that is really critical from the perspective of getting to sort of a net zero state, not only because we need political buy-in, we need this to feel and be fair and just, to have political support, also because that's the right thing to do. And thirdly, because I think, we need strategic infrastructural kind of transformation of the systems that are very fundamental to our economic model, from, transit to food to energy. in a way that needs to be sort of carefully planned so that we don't create, major harms for many people, often the poorest, in the process of that transition. And so I think on those kinds of tests, carbon pricing kind of doesn't succeed. And then lastly, this is a very long-winded answer, but I could talk about it forever. The actual empirical evidence on carbon pricing doesn't necessarily sort of stack up in its favor. So there's a really brilliant sort of meta-analysis of actual existing carbon pricing schemes that I cite in the book as well, and broadly finds that their impact is like on average between 0 and 2% emissions cuts per year, which is not exactly ideal given the timeline we're kind of facing, and is often in disagreement with some of the kind of statements of celebration around carbon pricing that just say, carbon pricing is effective without having that kind of empirical basis of evidence. And I think that's really important. And even in some of the more successful examples, the most salient being the European Union's emissions trading scheme, they celebrate 40% reductions, I think, since its inception over the past 15, 16 years. I've lost track of the dates. What year is it? But broadly, those sort of drops in emissions are very specific to a small number of industries that they could get politically into the scheme. And secondly, the analysis finds that a lot of that is a transition not to clean energy, not sort of durable, permanent overhaul of our fundamental industrial and energy systems, but instead sort of small tweaks to energy efficiency that are inherently limited, or the shift from sort of coal to gas sources of power, which makes exact sense if you think about the perspective of market actors, right? They don't care about term like justice or a permanent renewable energy system. If your concern is a new cost has been added to my operations, I need to eliminate that cost, those kinds of sort of short-term impermanent fixes make a lot of sense. And that, again, is I think one of the kind of inherent flaws of the carbon price is it's concerned with eliminating that cost, which may or may not be done in a way that is strategic, durable, just, fair, etc. And there's a very long answer to your question about
no, it's fine. It's fine. And the second area I wanted to ask you about was carbon offsetting, which I've always been suspicious of. And your book actually confirmed many of my suspicions, I have to say, particularly how that offsetting money is used in other places.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me. That's the last bit of the carbon pricing answer, which is, again, because a lot of the time, solutions, to use that word, aren't necessarily available. So if you're a company who is an airline, for example, and there's a carbon price applied or some kind of tax, the ability to just switch to sort of zero carbon air travel obviously doesn't yet exist. And so their way to sort of cut costs has to be some other kind of form of participating in what have become sort of carbon markets. So instead of just applying like a tax to all these activities, broadly what we tend to see is carbon trading systems, which like the emissions trading scheme in the EU. Voluntary carbon markets have absolutely exploded, where companies can kind of trade emissions permits for carbon offsets, which effectively say, you've paid money for someone in this other country to plant some trees that will offset the sort of carbon that you've created. And these are now kind of essential kind of oil to grease the wheels of sort of carbon pricing as a scheme. And there are, many kind of issues that arise from that system. A lot of the time, these are policies that involve creating significant injustices for often indigenous or sort of subsistence farming communities in the global south. Really brilliant work from ActionAid, which is a not-for-profit, tracks that kind of land grabs from these communities or conversions of sort of regenerative subsistence farming into kind of monoculture plantations of trees to service the demand for carbon offsets of broadly the kind of comparatively globally affluent living in countries like the UK or Canada or the US, who, rather than try to actually eliminate carbon emissions from our economic processes, from our infrastructures, from our lives, it's much easier to simply sort of purchase a credit to avoid needing to do that hard work of actually cutting carbon. And carbon offsets come from a legitimate basis. So there's no real state of like true zero when it comes to sort of global carbon. And so the idea of net zero comes from that, which is that, there will need to be some forms of carbon drawdown, whether that's sort of reforestation or sort of other solutions. The difficulty is what is sort of a scientific necessity out of the kind of IPCC papers, which say, we need to reserve a certain amount of offsets for these kind of remaining emissions, residual emissions, they call them, that we simply can't cut from our systems. And that has been turned into voluntary system that has completely sprawled and is broadly supporting sort of preventing actually doing the hard work of decarbonizing, rather than being kind of set aside for residual emissions that we simply can't get around otherwise. And a lot of the time they're also plagued by just very basic questions around sort of legitimacy, materiality. So are they actually doing the things they say they're doing? Permanence, you might see, and this happens a lot, sort of a plantation or zone of trees designated for offsets that then ironically sort of go up in flames in a forest fire, and therefore kind of nullify the concept of the offset in the first place. So all these questions kind of plague the system. And I think this is what happens when, again, we decide to hand over authority over how we pursue the incredibly difficult task of decarbonizing the global economy to sort of the functioning of markets. Markets are very good at some things, but I guess my contention would be, delivering rapid and just and, permanent decarbonization in a strategic way doesn't seem to be one of them.
And the third area is this growing ESG. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. But here you've got major investment companies who control staggeringly large amounts of money. I mean, Vanguard is one of them, $7 trillion or something like that. But you've got these three main ones which you talk about: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. What's behind ESG, and does that deliver anything with the power that these companies have?
Yeah, so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance investing, for those who don't know, although many of us will now have been offered, through maybe our pension fund, an ESG kind of option or a climate friendly option. So I think it's becoming increasingly mainstream as a concept. But it broadly, speaks again to this idea that, okay, we need to massively shift investment because right now we're funneling it to the wrong things, like expanding fossil fuels, or to arms and cluster bombs or tobacco industry, whatever you might consider to be sort of a negative destination for finance. And if we just establish this kind of set of agreed criteria, then investors can be relied on to shift allocation into these better areas, whether we imagine that might be sort of clean energy or other kind of socially beneficial companies. Again, sounds nice as an idea. Very quickly, the proof is a bit in the pudding. And so ESG broadly is kind of dominated by funds that are investing in sort of stocks and bonds. That's what most of us have access to. And it's a kind of system that is, I think, a lot of the time criticized for greenwash, is what people describe. So you might see funds that claim to be climate friendly, but they're investing in fossil fuels, for example. Yeah. That to me, is absolutely a problem, but it's actually not the kind of core issue at hand. And this comes down to a slight kind of question of how we actually think about what we're doing with ESG. So ESG is designated or sort of based in the idea of reducing financial risks. And what I mean by that is, I'm an investor. I can see that climate regulation is coming down the line. I can see that, human rights violations might create massive lawsuits for the companies in my portfolio. And so to sort of minimize my exposure to those risks, I will invest according to ESG criteria, because I think it's going to be better in the long run for financial returns. So it's this whole idea of like doing well by doing good for the world. Minimizing your exposure to these risks is a fundamentally different question than sort of minimizing those, like the genesis of those risks, and actually contributing to alternatives to sort of eliminating those issues from the economy. So what you see, and an example of this is, sort of flagship funds from the big managers that you name there, whether it's BlackRock or Vanguard, their top ESG funds, you might expect very reasonably to see big renewable energy firms or sort of like social purpose companies dominating those portfolios. But instead, they tend to be just versions of mainstream economic or financial indices. So those are kind of baskets of companies that funds might sort of invest in. And they just take those, cut out a couple of the bad companies, and then broadly are filled with, your generic S&P 500s, the big kind of 500 corporates. So the Vanguard fund, as last time I checked, was filled with, its top holdings were what you'd expect: Facebook, Amazon, Google, big financial firms, big pharma. And that, I guess, is not unique to Vanguard, right? Like that is a feature rather than a bug of the logic, because if what you're saying is, I want to reduce my exposure to the risks of the fossil fuel industry, that's not the same as saying I want to invest in the transition to a green energy system. And that is kind of a fundamental flaw in the ESG system. We've done work at Commonwealth looking at all the kind of climate funds that are offered in the UK. And again, they're kind of chock-a-block full of financials, big pharma, big tech. Energy actually came out as like the smallest sort of in exposure in those portfolios. And that's, I guess, the product of this kind of this logic. And I think despite that, the idea that we can sort of green, or the financial system can green itself and everyone can do well by doing good, remains quite dominant. And is something that I think we need to contest, again, because, effectively, we do need massive shifts in capital allocation. And if we leave it to a system that is kind of fundamentally disinterested in what we're actually trying to achieve, that is, cutting emissions, improving human rights and labor rights throughout the kind of economy, it's just not going to achieve that. And so definitely I try to kind of, raise the alarm on that a lot. Although what's been interesting is recently there's been sort of a backlash from the kind of farther right wing in the US against kind of woke capital. So attacking ESG from a right perspective. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the kind of dominance of the industry as they come under fire from, BlackRock in particular, the biggest manager, is really coming under fire from sort of Republican state lawmakers, for example. So we'll see how it goes.
I mean, Larry Fink issues an annual letter, doesn't he, to shareholders and so on, and it's due soon. So maybe that
still waiting.
maybe that will trigger that moment. But one of the things that I find it so difficult to understand is these companies have immense power. They control a lot of money. But you have Vanguard, for example, last December pulling out of a net zero 2050 agreement. That's an abdication of responsibility, surely.
It definitely is. I think, as with all things, I will be sort of cynical about their impact. So ESG is one of them. I do think the sort of explosion of ESG reflects something positive in a political sense, even if materially it's not really shifting capital in the way it needs to, insofar as it reflects, I guess, this outpouring of demand from, for example, people with pensions saying, I don't want to put my money in something I consider to be bad for the world. I think that's a really positive shift. I also think, the fact that big investors and financial firms or corporations, even though these statements are often incredibly hollow, I feel that the fact that they feel the need to make them is a reflection, again, of a groundswell of political pressure, which is interesting in and of itself. So Vanguard pulling out of the sort of financial alliance for net zero that was established at Glasgow, so GFANZ, they love kind of sexy acronyms, is, in some ways entirely kind of inconsequential in a sort of in terms of what it means for what their investment practices will be, but is significant in terms of the message I think it sends, and in signaling that there is increasingly contestation of these ideas from the right and from the business community itself, who previously were really gung-ho and on board. Vanguard's an interesting case because they're primarily what's called a passive investor. So they track, I mentioned these before, but they track sort of indexes. So rather than having your kind of like Wolf of Wall Street type guys picking stocks and trying to do better than the market, index investing, which is really, really popular now, It's actually, I think, majority of fund assets in the US now. Instead, just try to track a list of companies and sort of just perform. They say if the S&P 500 goes up 5%, my fund will go up 5%. And so Vanguard primarily does that. And what they argue is that means that their hands are tied when it comes to shifting their investments. And they say, we can't deviate from these indices because our entire kind of product is based around tracking them. So it kind of makes they'd be the ones to leave. They're kind of famous for not wanting to rock the boat.
Yeah.
But it will be interesting to see what it means for the other kind of prominent investors, BlackRock, because it's a mix of active and passive, and because Larry Fink, I think, is a much more political figure, the CEO. They are really kind of, their neck is kind of very exposed compared to others. So it'll be interesting to see what their moves are, because I think a lot of the crowd will follow.
Yeah, there was an interesting article very recently in the online journal Unheard attacking Larry Fink. We'll put a link to it in the transcript that we do, but basically that was an attack on him being undemocratic, and they did conclude that his letter should just say, "Dear CAO, I'm sorry." And that was the letter that they said should be sent out. So
this is the great irony of sort of like the free market ideology, right? Is that what you have is an incredibly successful, in a capitalist system, an incredibly successful firm, the most successful investment firm in the US and globally, acting according to what it thinks is the right decision. And in some way, that's like a violation of market principles for those on the right, when it's a company acting exactly as ostensibly they should be. It's just that its actions are deemed inconvenient to those who might be climate deniers, or don't want to see fossil fuel companies kind of change their plans, etc.
Moving on to other forms of changing ownership, you have many in owning the future, and I just wanted to go through a few of these as examples. And the first, when you talk about democratization of production, we've talked a little bit about the stock market, but can we make the stock market work better, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good. Sorry, did you have more to the question there? Did I cut you off?
No, carry on. I'll come on to the second example in a moment.
Sure.
Let's look at the stock market first.
Sure. Yeah, the stock market is quite interesting in terms of, we've talked about kind of, I guess, the question of capital allocation, which I think people really associate with the stock market, when in actual fact, the stock market is not, when people buy a share, there's this impression, I think, widespread, that you are sort of injecting new money into a corporation, and therefore you are investing in that company, in the sense that you're giving them money to do more things. The vast majority of what takes place on stock markets is not that. It's mostly sort of shares trading hands between speculators and investors who want to, profit from a rising share price. And so you're not actually putting new money into the company the vast majority of the time. You're just buying it off of some other investor. And what you actually get out of owning shares is, one, the right to kind of sell them for a return down the line, but two, there are sort of governance rights attached to share ownership. So you get to cast votes in corporate annual general meetings, which is where, various resolutions might be brought about whether to appoint a director to the board, or whether you should have rules around kind of sort of wage ratios, whether you should decarbonize your business plans. All these kind of questions can be brought at AGMs, and owning a share gives you the right to vote on them. And right now, because share ownership is absolutely dominated by sort of a shrinking number of very powerful asset management firms, we have an incredibly undemocratic system of sort of corporate governance rights. You've got kind of the board, you've got these mega shareholders, and you've got, workers or people in, customers or supply chains, et cetera, broadly excluded from the governance of the firm, even though arguably they have the strongest case for governance, because they know how the production actually happens, they know what they need, they know what problems on the ground are, et cetera. And so some of our proposals in owning the future look at this question around the kind of nexus of power between capital markets, or the stock market, and the corporation, and the fact that stock markets broadly just discipline corporations into serving one purpose, which is to kind of disgorge cash to shareholders through the form of dividends or stock buybacks, whether or not that's to the detriment of any other kind of outcome. And so we kind of use the cheeky kind of phrase like abolish the stock market in the book. I think what we really mean there is, abolish it's a much less sexy phrase, but like abolish the attachment of sort of income and governance rights from the share unit in the corporation, to liberate it from that kind of discipline and really bring in the kind of involvement of other stakeholders like workers, and other kind of forms of governance, I guess, to kind of ensure that the incredible productive and organizing and coordinating power of the corporate form can be organized towards meeting kind of socially and environmentally productive and useful ends, rather than its single disciplining purpose right now, which is to maximize shareholder returns.
And one of the areas you talked about in the book and was about the Lucas plan from all those years ago of Lucas Aerospace. I was thinking back last night in preparation for this, and I suddenly realized when I was rereading your book that the first event I ever did, and I've done thousands in my time, was actually when I was a student, bringing some of the workers from Lucas Aerospace to come and talk to the students about this wonderful idea they had about turning what they were producing then into something positive. And I've often thought then about how you make that, durable, because it is genuinely transformative, I think. But just tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the Lucas plan is, kind of a phenomenal moment, an example of what we kind of argue for on a grand scale in Owning the Future, which is, absolutely how can it be justifiable that the governance of a corporation or a company is absolutely dominated by a small cohort of executive directors and then shareholders who may never have actually even invested in the company in that kind of material sense that we talked about. So you may have never injected new capital into the company, and yet because you are BlackRock or a speculator on a stock market, you get to control and have a say over how it operates. And so, in the form of the Lucas plan, with workers deciding on drawing up a plan for transforming the kind of production that they do and serving kind of socially beneficial ends. I think they talked about heat pumps and wind turbines out of what they were producing. That is, I just think, the quintessential example of what we'd be advocating for, and really reflects, I think, one, that the workers are much more than some absentee shareholder, really invested in not just disgorging cash to shareholders, but in actually ensuring the kind of success and the productivity and the utility of a company. And who knows better how to do that than they might. And so, absolutely, kind of across the economy, we kind of call for like a more generalized sort of Lucas plan model, which would see a much more diverse array of stakeholders represented in governing production, which is, the fundamental kind of source of everything in our economy. That sounds very obvious to say, but governance of how we produce, what we produce, why, in what quantities, is so monopolized by a very small kind of elite cohort of investors or executive directors, in a way that I think many of us can see is incredibly destructive and, not serving, the ends that society needs, whether that's, decarbonizing our energy system or, providing many of the basics that people need to survive at, an affordable, secure kind of rate.
I mean, certainly I remember when we were doing this work, and I'm talking now about the early 1980s, how ahead of the time they were when they were talking about things like wind turbines and so on. Moving on to the second area, democratization of provision. What's your view about the burgeoning call for universal basic services as a principle for the way we should operate an economy?
So in Owning the Future, we talk about sort of three principles, one of which is kind of democratizing production. The second is sort of decommodifying, I guess, is the phrase we use. I think all the kind of very basics that all of us need to survive, to live good, decent lives, to participate in society. And that could be anything from sort of health and care, which right now is, as again, many will know in the UK, utterly kind of in crisis, or education, or food, or energy, water. All of these, fundamentals without which we can't participate in society, but which right now are predominantly organized around profit maximization for particular shareholders. And so you see, soaring rates of kind of child poverty in the UK, of fuel poverty, the kind of cost of living crisis that we see. Obviously, there's a lot of exogenous factors there, but there is nonetheless, a critical element there of organizing on a broad scale the provision of all these fundamentals around the profit motive. Those two things are kind of inherently in conflict much of the time. And I think we can really see the impacts of that. And so we would advocate for, we didn't try to have an exhaustive list of what this might be, but in line with the kind of UBS or Universal Basic Services agenda, I think, really thinking about what the justification is for trying to organize something that none of us can do without around sort of private ownership, private control and provision, and profit maximization. And what could possibly be the justification for that kind of a system. And I have yet to see sort of an answer that I find altogether convincing, although there are many people that will make it.
I mean, but this is where things like the arguments for prioritizing the foundational economy come in as well, don't they? There's these very basic things that were applied in, during the pandemic, we were all happily clapping for nurses, and now they can't secure their pay increase that they're asking for.
Yeah, and in addition to that, there are all sorts of elements of that kind of foundational economy that aren't even sort of considered in an economic sense. So, so many carers, or so much care is currently provided right now, sort of unpaid, unwaged, and it's provided in a way that means that people might not be able to work as much as they otherwise would, and therefore are made poorer, broadly as a result of our societal failure to create these kind of infrastructures of care, something that we would argue should be kind of decommodified insofar as without childcare, without care for the elderly, it's really a kind of shooting yourself in the foot kind of approach to organizing an economy, because you have, even if you were like an ultra capitalist, you end up with a workforce that is strained, that is less able to work, that is tired, that is women, and all these kinds of questions. So even from the perspective of your capitalist economy, it makes no sense. And then we would take that argument further by saying, just in principle, these are systems that should be intrinsically valued and, made available to all. If we, make the claim that we'd like to live in a kind of just and genuinely free society.
The final thing I just want to ask you about here is about you advocate looking seriously at the commons as a theme, don't you? Recovering, from the old tragedy of the commons that, was around, however many decades ago now, but actually looking seriously at this as the way of looking at these problems, but also of organizing things as well.
Yeah, we think there are, many instances where a commons-based system of governance to kind of steward what are collectively generated or collectively held kind of assets, or things that should be collectively held, whether that's, sort of data systems. So, all the kind of massive systems of data that private companies currently monopolize and use to, target ads to us, that's data that we all collectively produce, and its use could therefore be sort of governed in a kind of commons infrastructure. We also think about it from the perspective of kind of land and stewardship of sort of nature and natural resources, these things that, are the kind of free gifts of the earth to all of us, and again, which are sort of cordoned off by private actors to be used for private profit. There are many systems we think that commons governance could be reclaimed. And I think what we try to contest is the idea, there's a really widespread idea because of the tragedy of the commons, that kind of thought experiment, which basically said that if you have like a open piece of land, all the farmers will like graze it to death, which is in no way a common in the actual sense of the word. A commons is not just kind of a free-for-all where no one involved in it has any kind of connection to each other, where there's no systems of governance. A commons is a very purposeful set of rules, checks and balances, relationships between people that all decide how resources should be stewarded collectively, rather than things being stewarded for a kind of very narrow private kind of interest. And there's a lot of brilliant examples of these systems working really effectively, particularly when it comes to stewardship of things like nature. And some of those are cited in the book, so I won't go through them.
One of our main areas of work is about the future of cities. Do you see any special role for cities in this? You talked in the book, for example, about rewilding urban spaces and so on, but you can't just do that. You've got to rewild everywhere else as well, really, that needs rewilding. But is there a special role for cities, do you think, particularly in terms of how the world is rapidly urbanizing? And if we can't get cities right, we may not be able to get anything else right.
I mean, absolutely. I think particularly with respect to your point there about, the ongoing urbanization of the world, there's no ignoring the kind of growing scale of and power kind of vested in cities. And I think what's been interesting is in many instances, whether that's in the UK or the US, all around Europe, cities with political powers and sort of some degree of autonomy or sovereignty have been really vital kind of points of contestation against what may be sort of a more regressive kind of national level politics. And I think that's really, really brilliant as sort of models for how things could be and to enable people to really see in the here and now, this is how life could be different at a grander scale. But I think the key point there is that we can't just kind of rely on sort of islands of kind of hope and sort of green, kind spaces from which many around the world or even domestically would still be excluded. I think the key is to make sure that those are always seen as sort of prefigurative models that are linked up to a much wider kind of more global kind of understanding of the changes that we need to make to have sort of a more fairer and more sustainable world. So making sure that we don't kind of see them as isolated projects, but as linked to a much greater kind of effort towards creating a fairer, more sustainable future.
And one of those areas which we're looking at now is the pilots on, well, two areas really. The first is the universal basic income idea, which is an old idea, but which is now coming back, and various pilots. And the second is the 4-day week idea. And there's all this work coming out now on the pilots that took place recently on this. And it seems to me that UBI, I think, is a hard one, but 4-day week actually seems possible, I think. Do you share that view?
I do. So it's been really interesting to see like the scale and the kind of positivity of the response to those trials. I think, obviously something like the 4-day week is much easier for certain kind of sectors and certain types of kind of economic background. But I absolutely believe that it is, the way I always put it is, we didn't used to have weekends, right? And that was a win of the trade union movement. That is something that involved a reorganization of production. Companies just had to deal and to adapt. And so absolutely is something that is achievable and is, desirable. We should continue on this trajectory of using our productive capacities, using innovation and technology and the resources have built collectively to, free us to spend more time enjoying our lives and enjoying things that don't involve, the waged relationship. I think that's bizarrely become kind of a controversial statement to make, that we should desire to work less. But it's something that isn't, a new idea. Human progress has always been kind of, in like the Enlightenment, for example, been understood as kind of liberating us to do all these other things. These aren't new ideas, but I think they are often denigrated as kind of like soft lefty ideals rather than something that is very consistent in the kind of arc of history and of trying to just make all of our lives better.
I mean, certainly to make a 4-day week fair, you do have to consider those areas of work where 4-day weeks may not be possible and how you compensate and so on for that time and money and so on. But it struck me that there seems to be, it's probably foolish to say so, but a momentum developing behind an idea like that compared to some others. I mean, that brings me on to my final question, which is about, the point you make about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, that, do we have the imagination to move forward, and how do we make that politically work?
Second part of the question is a tougher one. I think we do. I think one of the key arguments in The Value of a Whale is that it is a kind of tragedy that in many instances we've kind of lost our ability to imagine anything that doesn't, any kind of solution or policy that doesn't kind of conform to the very narrow frame of sort of a capitalist economic system. And therefore we kind of lose sight of many sort of creative options that might be available to us. I don't think it's been lost entirely. I think we're just, the way I put it is we're all really out of practice.
Yeah.
And I would put myself in that camp as well. You know, I work in a think tank that produces policy, and we still will publish things that, you know, we justify policies on the basis of cost savings to be made, rather than necessarily on the basis of, you know, this will make everyone's lives better and more democratic and etc. So I think it requires sort of a conscious effort to actually go back to the real basics, which is, you know, what are the principles that many of us share? I think we want to see, you know, an economic and political system that is democratic, in which, you know, everyone is guaranteed kind of a basic degree of dignity. I don't think that's a lot to ask, but it feels like it under our current model. And I think if you just ask people that question, you know, what is it in your life that you really value? What is it that makes your life better? What is it that you cherish? And use that as kind of a first principles starting point. You can then work back into the kind of what are the policies and ways that we get there, and try to think more imaginatively. I think we very often fail to start from those very first principles. So that's kind of the approach I take, I guess.
I mean, these are debates which we talk about. These debates we have in Bristol a lot, and we'll be returning to some of these points in our Festival of the Future City at the end of the year. But thank you so much, Adrienne, for joining us today. The Value of a Whale on the Illusions of Green Capitalism is published by Manchester University Press, and Owning the Future, Power and Property in an Age of Crisis is published by Verso. We recommend both books highly. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.